Welcome to this video. I'm Soren. Today we're going to be looking at the Goslings' music to learn how they write their songs, how they produce their songs, pretty much everything about the band. We're going to be doing this primarily by going through their best album, in my opinion, Grandeur of Hair. We're going to be looking at the song structure primarily because that is what forms the story of the song, and the stories of the song and the album as a whole is the most important thing, in my opinion, that we can learn here. Now, I just finished covers of every song on the album, so that's where we'll be getting a lot of this information from, and check out those covers if you're interested in that. I love the start of the album here because it really gives us insight into what we're in for the entire album, even though it's just this short little introduction at the start of the song. Now, we just have that drone note in the background going for the bass. Quite simple. There's a few more notes in there, but for the most part, just that drone going in. And then the chaotic drums over that. Now, the drums are really fascinating because they almost act like a precursor to all the noise that we get later on in the album, even though later on all that noise is generated by the other guitars, the vocals, the tape noise, everything like that. Here, it's just the extremely chaotic drums substituting all that noise in for us. It's quite a beautiful hint into the future there. Then from there, this section also sets the pace, because the album as a whole is quite a slow album. Things take a lot of time to build and morph and change and whatever. Just like this section, very slow, few notes being used, few note diversity, but it works as a hint to what we're in for. Now let's go into the dichotomy between the two riffs of this next section in the song once the song gets going. So this clash between the harsh, more ugly, more dissonant sounds that the Goslings have and their more beautiful consonant sounds, that's kind of the key to what makes the Goslings sound like the Goslings. It's all encompassing in all their music, and especially this album, of course, as we'll take a look at. Now, as for the riffs themselves, we'll start with the more positive, so to speak, riff. So notice how it's kind of throwing around energy everywhere. It's giving away a bit of energy. It's positive. It's more uplifting. It kind of has a jovial vibe to it, right? Now compare that to the other riff of this section. So when you see those two riffs side by side, you can see how there's kind of a push and pull effect between them, where the first riff is giving off a lot more energy and it's much freer. Whereas the second riff is a lot more dissonant, there's a lot more tension in there, and it's kind of pulling back on what we've been giving away. Now, as for the note selection itself, let's just look at that dissonant riff, because it gives us a lot of insight into the dissonant side of their note selection. So it's primarily that minor second there. That's, one fret apart, those two notes, or one semitone. So the Goslings unlike other metal bands, especially doom metal bands, they don't really like to use the tritone. That's 6 frets apart, 6 semitones. They don't really use it at all, to be honest. Whenever they want dissonance, they usually go to the minor second, the 1 fret, 1 semitone apart interval. Now that's just one of the parts that makes their note selection unique compared to a lot of similar bands. Let's take a look at the next part of the song, the drone section. Now, these sort of drone sections are used pretty commonly in the Gosling's music, usually for quite a similar purpose, which is to sort of build energy. And they're done in a similar way most of the time, which is centering around that one drone note and then, having all the texturing and everything going on around it with the background guitars, the vocals, all that stuff. Another thing to note is that they usually have a short little preparation phase, I like to call it, a little section leading into the drone part where they sort of take everything back. The drum stops for a bit, maybe other hectic texturing stops for a little bit, and then they start up the drone section. Now, as for the note selection itself, we're centering around this G sharp here. That's the main drone note. And then we have the background guitars doing this descending line. Now, the key thing here to pay attention to is the relation between the drone note and this descending riff. So we have first that first note, and then we go into the minor second once again, finally into the octave. Notice once again the push and pull effect we have there with that second note, the minor second, then going into the last note of that descending riff, the octave. Because that conflict between the two notes is sort of what makes this section interesting. Creates a little bit of a ambiguity in this section, and that's something we'll touch on later, just how there's a bit of abstraction, a bit of an abstract feeling throughout the entire album. Now that we've gone through each section a little bit more in depth, let's take a look at the song structure as a whole of the song. So we start off with that intro, the part based around the drone note, the G sharp, and we go into a little A-B section, the A being the riff we saw earlier. Then we go into the B, the dissonant riff from earlier. And then C. So C we didn't talk about because C is just a variation on the B riff, just played a slightly different way, not worth mentioning really. So then we go back to another B, to another C, and then we end it off with A and B. From there we have the drone preparation phase like we talked about. Then we go into the entire drone section, build energy, and a short little intro right at the end, 10 or so seconds to close out the song. We come off that energy build at the end of Onakar in the drone section with this energy explosion, this release right at the start of Croatan with the trebly guitars leading into the main descending riff that defines the section. That riff being like this. Now an important thing to mention here is that the riff actually starts on the third note there, not the first note. Like that. Now this is important because if you listen really closely to the texturing, the noise there on those first two notes, so the third and fourth note of the riff itself, the texture gets a lot more noisy, and then as the riff starts, for real on its first note, the noise pulls back a little bit. Now throughout this entire 2 or so minute section where this riff is repeating, the noise levels will vary slightly in that way, but you can really hear that difference pronounced there in the beginning of it. Now, another thing to mention, over time, as this riff plays, even though it begins as a big energy release, as this riff keeps repeating itself and a bunch of the energy is released, it kind of starts to reverse that. It starts to become an energy grow section. As that intent changes in the listener's mind, you kind of get a different effect there happening. And this is even though the riff pretty much stays the same the entire time, with the exception of those, variations in noise, which isn't really the riff itself. And then also there is a slight variation in the riff pretty much near the end of it as we are about to transition into the next part of the song. But it's still fascinating to see that shift happen. From that variation of the descending riff, we go back to the descending riff for a little bit, and then we transition into the preparation for our next drone phase, and then the drone phase itself, of course. Now, this drone phase is very, very similar to the Onekar drone. Basically, it's centered around that main note, this time A sharp. Then we have all the things on the side, the guitars and whatnot, constructing the texture, supporting everything. And it's all a build, an energy build for the climax of the song. So essentially the same purpose as the Onekar drone section. We're just building energy for the release that's going to happen soon. Before we get into the climax itself of the song, we need a little primer on the production, the mixing sort of techniques the Goslings do. Now, the biggest thing they rely on is this sort of effect that happens in pretty much all music, just more in the Goslings, where when one element of the music goes up in volume, for instance, then the other elements will go down to sort of make room for it because of, compression limiting, etc., especially on the master chain. So the Goslings, because of how loud their music is, how compressed it is and everything, well, this effect is sort of amplified. So you'll really be able to hear it much more clearly than in other music. Like, for example, when drums hit on Haruspex, you can literally hear the distortion that causes as the other layers make way for that drum hit. So they tie these sort of production things in the texture to make their texture feel like a living, breathing thing. They tie this with their songwriting. So for instance, if they want a part to sound prominent in the story of the song, it'll be louder, which of course has this effect on the texture. So then these tied together to basically create the Gosling sound at the end of it. Now back to Croatan, this is what they do during the climax with the bass. So the bass will come in super loudly, intermittently, take all the energy away from the layers beside it, derive that energy into the bass while narrowing the stereo field, importantly. Then the energy gets released as the layers come back, the stereo field widens again, and that kind of creates a mini micro sort of energy build and release short-term effect. So I'll play a little sample here now of the climax. Just pay attention to how this effect will sort of vary now. So sometimes the bass will take, a ton of energy from the layers around it, and sometimes it'll take a little bit less. And this will change drastically how much the other layers go down in volume, right? So sometimes the bass is like the only thing you can hear when it does this. And other times it gets louder, but only a little bit. They use these more short-term micro production techniques and whatnot, combined with their more long-term ones like volume automation that we'll touch on later, to create their unique brand of texturing. Now the riff itself here. Notice how much more movement there is in a riff like that, one of those riffs that they use to release energy rather than their other riffs. Also, there's a crazy amount of variation in how they play this riff. Look at my cover if you're interested in that. Now let's get into the song structure. So the song starts off like we talked, with releasing its energy in the repeating descending riff. And then slowly that riff begins to build energy back up. We go into a small little variation of the riff right at the end of it to lead into the preparation of the drone section. We have the drone section, leads into the climax, which is when we release all this energy we've been building for the entire song. When I think of the album as a whole, I like to pair together the first two songs, Onekar and Croatan, together, because together they act as a sort of induction to the album, where they show us what we're in for, they show us what sort of energy highs and lows we're going to have, how the flow of the album's going to work, how the texturing's going to work. A little taste of everything, really. And also Onekar, I think of basically one big energy build for Croatan. Going into Golden Stair now, I think this is the most interesting song on the album because it breaks the Gosling's mold more than any other song. It's quite a strange structure, as we'll talk about at the end. And as for right now, though, the intro, because we just came off the energy high, the energy release of the last song, now we have this chill section for a little bit, which is just driven by the drums mainly forward. And then everything else just forms the texture around it, all the sound effects, which is, you know, we hear the sound of fingers sliding over strings. We hear people talking super quietly, super muffled. There's some like sci-fi sounding sort of effects. There's a lot in there. And as for the drums themselves, the main thing to talk about them is that it's a really clear example of the production technique I was talking about earlier. Basically, I mean, you can just hear how saturated the drums are, especially because they record to tape, the Goslings, not digitally. And that really comes out in the saturation here in the drums. A little detail I want to talk about in this song, part of what makes it have such a unique texture compared to every other song on the album, this little sound effect. I'll play a sample of it now where it plays, you know, a few times in a row. So I'm not entirely sure how they did it. It almost sounds like somebody tapping on the string, something like that, but I don't think that's it. Anyway, the important thing is that, like I said, this is the only spot this sound shows on the entire album, just the first 3 minutes of the song. And importantly, even though it kind of sounds random the first time you hear it, it almost sounds like it might have just been like an accident left in one of the guitar recordings or something. But if you actually pay attention to where it's placed, it's pretty much the exact same spot. The way that it, you know, relates to the riff itself. It happens at the exact same time. I'll pull up a graph here, hopefully, that shows how that works. Now I'm going to play the next section of the song out for you. I want you to pay attention to the changes I was talking about earlier, the automation. So the changes over time and volume of different layers and stuff. Basically, just pay attention to how the texture as a whole and the individual parts change, morph, etc. throughout the section. I'll put up visual of the cues and stuff I had for little details, but for the first time around, you shouldn't really look at this because it mainly focuses on the small details, the small changes, like, you know, changes in how a drum part is played, an extra cymbal here and there, something like that. So I wouldn't look at this until afterward. So the main things to mention with that section are that, first off, the riff part of the guitars basically slowly lose power over time over the entire section. And second, when the vocals come in, pretty much everything in the mix makes way for the vocals. And then at a certain point, the riff part of the guitars pretty much fades completely as the feedback takes over every part of that. And then when that happens, a bit afterward, the drums themselves become much louder again to make up for what they lost when the vocals came in. And they also become much harsher, as in the attack on them is a lot sharper. There is less release at the end of the transient. Also, there's a layer of noise somewhere in the middle that it has a very similar thing to the guitars, where it just slowly becomes eaten by the feedback. Not as much as the guitars, though. So you can see how all the moving parts, they do their own thing, their own changes, but they all come together at the end to form the texture and tell the story of the section. Because Gosling's music is very unified at the end of the day. No parts are really telling their own separate story. It's all coming together for that one final texture, because the texture tells the story in Gosling's music, essentially. Now let's get into the riff itself for a bit. So that's basically it. As you can see, it's very similar to the last riff of the last song, the climax riff, because it has that movement that a lot of other Gosling's riffs don't have. So it has that movement so that we can release energy during the section that we were building in the intro of the song. Now, the other thing to mention about it, I don't want to touch on a tiny little variation too much, because there's so much of it, and there's no point in overloading, but let's just look at a bit of how the guitars do it. This is one common way that they do it in Gosling's. So there's basically an extra note on some of the repeats of the riff. Now, an important thing to note about this is the way it works. Basically, it's a A-B thing for the first like 5 or 6 repeats, and then it stops for a little bit, and then when it comes back, it does the variation of it 3 times in a row, I believe. But this entire time, if we think of the whole section like this entire time, that B variation, that extra note, gets quieter and quieter as we go on through the reps. Finally, we've got the feedback. The feedback's the exact same note for the entire section, but it starts off with just the high note like this. And then we add on the lower octave for a bit more dimension. Now, moving on to the another production trick. Well, it's essentially the same one, but we see it very clearly here, where when you have one layer, something continuous, let's say, and then you have the drum, and when the drum hits, the layer goes down in volume right as the drum hits. So we'll be doing that here with the guitar noise, like this sound. You have that in the background, and then each time that the drum hits, it'll go down in volume. So this has to be done in a very specific, intentional way. Essentially, what I mean is the settings on this, so the amount of time it takes after the drum hits for the guitar to go down in volume, and the amount of time it takes for it to go back up in volume, you have to get the settings perfect on that so that you can get an effect for the ear that's pleasant, right? So this is interplay between layers in the texture is what makes the Gosling's texture feel alive. It breathes life into it, right? Now, closing out the song, let's go over the song structure a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, the song structure in this one is the most strange out of any song on the album. The edges between sections are completely blurred. So it's kind of hard to tell where one section starts and one begins a lot of the time. So that's why I like to just use the model of energy build and energy release. We can see that despite the sections being muddy. So we start off with the intro, which is just energy grow. Very chill. Then we have the energy release in the first section of the song. After that, there's a short little transition, and then we go back to energy building in the part of the song where the synth starts. Then we have quite a strange series of events to close out the song, beginning with a sort of extended winding down session from this synth. We sort of pull back on a lot of the textures and the energy and just bring it down a bunch, which transitions into the quite tense, anxious section we showed earlier with the rapid drumming. That transitions into the strumming, which is the final release of all this energy, of the tension, of everything. To cool off after the excitement of Golden Stair's finale, we've got Overnight. Overnight's a glacially slowest song on the album. It's extremely repetitive with very slow riffing, as we'll get into. So for this song, the main thing I'll focus on here is just the song structure and the note selection, because there's not a ton going on in this song. It's a very simple song. There's not that much to learn from it, to be honest. Even for Gosling standard, it's a simple song. So we'll be doing the song structure first. So let's get into that. The first thing to note is that it's an A-B sort of structure for the first 3-4 minutes of the song. The A is this riff here. So I know the riff is extremely slow and each note is played a strange amount of times. So I'll just to simplify so we can really see what's going on with the notes, I'll play it again, but each note played once. So the song begins off with the intro, which is just a variation of the A riff essentially. And then we have the standard, so to speak, version of the A riff. So it essentially starts with 2 A riff sections in a row. And then we have the B riff. Now the B riff again is extremely slow riff with only 3 notes this time. And the first note's played 8 times, and then the other 2 are played 4 times. So the riff sounds or lasts a lot longer than you'd expect a 3-note riff to sound. But again, for simplicity, I'll play each note just 1 time. Now after this B, we go back into another A section, which is once again a slight variation on the standard A, and then back to B until the end of the song, which is a long time because this B starts at about the 3:30-minute mark, and there's only one variation in how it's played at around 7 minutes. Small variation. Now let's talk about the note selection because that's what's really makes it interesting when you see what's going on here and how the repetition of the song makes sense. It changes the meaning of the notes. So we start off the song and the A riff with a D, the 8th fret here on my F sharp string. So right away, when you hear that note, it sets in the listener's mind a certain meaning with the note, right? It gives it a pleasant sounding connotation, especially once you hear the 2 notes after it. And it kind of centers the whole riff around this D. So the other important thing to note about the A riff though is the 4th note. So if we play it again here. So you can see because the 4th note, the 9th fret, is just 1 fret above the initial note, it sounds a bit out of place. There's a bit more instability to it compared to the notes we've heard up to that point, right? So that sets the meaning for that note in the listener's head when they hear it in that context. But then once we switch to the B riff later on, we start on the 6th fret here, and then move up to the 9th fret. Not the 8th like you might expect, the 9th fret. So, and then the 11th fret. So altogether 6 to 9 to 11. So you can hear in this sort of ascending riff, the 9th fret note has a completely different meaning. Not completely different, but fairly different meaning. It's a lot more consonant, sounds more pleasant, uplifting, which obviously contradicts a lot of the meaning that we've given the note in the A riff. So this is important because, as I noted earlier, from the 3:30-minute mark onward till the end of the song, the B riff is repeated the entire time, which means that even though in the first little portion of the song, this 9th fret note has been given 2 different meanings, after that point, we only hear it in the B riff, which means that the meaning that the B riff gives it becomes more and more engraved, more concrete in the listener's head. So this is important because it removes that instability that the A riff had with the 9th fret note. This combines with the background guitars and the vocals and everything to give this song that sort of uplifting feeling, the uplifting story it has, where by the end of the song, the like 8-9 minute mark, it feels like you're being, washed with like some calming rain or something like that. Just as an example there. So that's the key of the note selection and the interplay between these 2 riffs in the song. And it's what forms the story of the song. Let's look at the texture quickly, because this song, there's a rare opportunity in the intro to the song to hear just the guitar and bass without the drums, without vocals, without effects really. to just hear the guitar and bass and hear their interplay and how the notes they're playing relate with the interplay between them to form the entire texture. So I'll play a little sample here, just the intro quickly, and I want you to pay close attention to anything you notice, anything you hear in this texturally. Tying it all together now, let's look at the background guitars, the ones that, contribute a lot to the building feeling of this song, the ones with all the effects on them. Primarily, they're based around this ascending and descending 3-note run here. About 90% of what they play is just a variation on that. They might switch up the timing a little bit, or add in a slightly more dissonant note or a more pleasant one, but 90% of it's that. Now you can see when you combine this overall nice sounding run with the thing we were talking about earlier, the B riff repeating, completely leaving the A riff behind, because the B riff has that new meaning with the 9th fret, this nicer meaning. So you combine those two things together, and you can see how the story starts to take shape. The story of starting a lot rougher, and then moving into this new ground, new territory that sounds like something washing over you, something nice, some warm water, The other thing to note is that the ascending, descending riff we talked about there, it doesn't just start with that, right as the B riff starts repeating and we start building. First, they play some other notes, and those other notes serve as their own build to the ascending, descending riff, so that when you first hear it, it sounds like a mini sort of like climax, and then that carries over, it lasts, keeps going until the end of the song. Finally, you remember that 6th fret note that begins the B riff? Well, in some of the A riff's variations, it'll replace one of its notes with that 6th fret note of the B riff. So that way there's a bit of continuity there and a bit of meaning manipulation with that note as well. Overall, when we look at the note manipulation, plus the changes in texture, the background guitars that come in, the vocals, we can see how the story of the song takes shape. How it goes from this sort of rough beginning and slowly builds and transforms into a more relaxing, nearly calming wash over the listener. Doing the covers for the album, one of the questions I wanted to answer was, why does Overnight into Sanibel into Windowpane feel like its own little storyline within the album? So that's what we're going to be talking about first for Sanibel, which means we're going to be doing the song structure and note selection first. We've got a long drone section, a 2.5-minute drone section right at the start of Sanibel here. This one's quite different, though, than our other drone sections, because this one we sort of close everything in on itself. So we're centering everything around just the drone note and the drums. Unlike the other ones where you had a whole fleshed out texture, all the side guitars and the vocals, just like what we had at the end of Overnight. So we have that contrast going into the song here. And for the notes themselves, we start the first 20 seconds with a C sharp, the 7th fret. Note that doesn't fit into what we were just hearing in Overnight, the 6, 9, 11 ascending thing. It doesn't quite fit in, so we're met right away with a bit of conflict, but that's fine, as you'll see. So after that, we have another 20 seconds. This time we go to the D sharp, the 9th fret note. Now that's obviously important because now we're back to familiar ground. We're back to that note we talked about, the one that had its meaning shifted. Finally, 20 seconds of that note, and now we have, a few minutes of the 12th fret, the F sharp. So if you'll notice, the Overnight was the 6, 9, 11 thing, and now over the course of, 40 seconds at the start of Sanibel, we have 7, 7, 9, 12. As opposed to the 6, 9 one. So you'll see very similar, but a little bit different. Now, this is important because as we come into the 2:30-minute mark of Sanibel, everything sort of explodes. You know, we have all the side guitars come in and everything, the vocals, all that. But now we center the whole song around just the F sharp and the D sharp, the 9th and 12th fret note. So even though we, at this point in the song, coming off that F sharp drone, we reintroduce the D sharp note, that familiar note from Overnight. So we go back into a little bit of that vibe we had at the end of Overnight, especially because, like I said, all the guitars are coming back and everything, that entire texture, similar reverbs and everything. So we go back into that, except now we have the F sharp note. Instead of the 6th fret, the C, and the 11th, the F, we now are centering the whole thing around the F sharp and D sharp. So the meaning again shifts for the note, the D sharp. The meaning once again shifts, but also the story that we're telling here shifts a little bit. So from the 40-second mark up until the start of the sample I just played, we only hear the F sharp note just droning on there for a few minutes, right? Now this sample starts and we're still, all we've added is the D sharp for that D sharp F sharp line. So we're still only hearing 2 notes for minutes at a time. And well, this time for another minute until the 3:45-minute mark, where finally we get some variation. We get the descending run. So the reason that run comes in so powerful, so much more powerful than it otherwise would, is because we've literally only been hearing 2 notes for the last few minutes of the song, pretty much since the beginning of the song. So our palette just gets cleansed, gets completely reinvigorated with this descending run. Also note that the run ends again on the F sharp. So we're going back to home base there. Now this effect gets replicated at the 5-minute mark when the solo comes in. Right as the solo comes in is when we switch to the descending riff. Then also note that the solo itself, of course, adds even more new notes to our palette, which then amplifies its power even more. As we've gone over, this entire section is supported by the texture, since we're really only hearing the same 2 notes over and over, besides the descending runs once in a while. So let's take a look at how exactly the texture is actually being made interesting. So we'll hear a little sample right at the start of the solo for a little bit, because this is a really interesting part, because the solo kind of takes over the story of the song for a little bit here as it's at its loudest. So the first thing is the little build up to the solo. We hear this B really loud. It's sort of bent and then released like that. It serves as just the build up. Like I said, it's very loud, so it's kind of like a herald. It heralds the solo coming, right? Now, as for the solo itself, it does a bit of tremolo picking into it really quietly, but the first 3 notes we actually hear loud and audible are here. So take note of how similar that is to the Overnight climax with its sort of solo-ish guitars coming in. I mean, it's the same it's all 2 semitones up each note, and it's 3 notes. So very similar there. Now, lastly, I'd like to say focus on the feedback as we listen to this sample. Focus on how the feedback supports the entire story and the solo, because the feedback is the primary thing that's constructing the texture throughout this entire section. Even at, the non-solo part of this section, when we're not hearing the descending riff, when we're just hearing the F sharp and D sharp going on, the feedback is the primary thing supporting it, and the vocals, of course. So focus on that. Now, this time I'll put on a bit of on-screen text to describe a few more things that you should pay attention to as I'm playing the sample. For the outro here, let's just touch on a few things, nothing too in-depth. First thing, obviously, we've gone back to just the F sharp and D sharp, this time played a little bit differently, but still just those 2 notes. Then the drums, of course, overtake everything. Now this is interesting to note because if you remember at the start of the song, the first 2.5 minutes, the drums are an important part there, but they're extremely sparse compared to now, where we've switched over to pretty much just cymbals, but they're very rapid and take over the entire texture pretty much. Now, another thing, I'll play a little sample. So pay attention to the sound effects panned a little bit to your right here. They sound like something's been put in reverse. Now, this is a trick we hear a few times in Gosling songs. They mainly do it with vocals where they'll put something in reverse. Let's finish Sanibel off by going over the song structure one more time, but as a whole, looking at everything, especially the notes. I'll mark all the little note changes and little changes in energy, drums, everything in the graph here this time. From Sanibel into Windowpane. Windowpane acts as a sort of rest for our ears. It is the least noisy song on the album, going into Haruspex, the most noisy song on the album. So it acts as a little break and a little build of anticipation for the finale to the album. Now we'll be looking into the whole overnight into Sanibel, into Windowpane, and into Haruspex, that connection. That's what we'll be focusing on for Windowpane. So the first thing to note is just the note selection. Again, note selection is nearly identical to Sanibel on the bass. So the The main focus is again the F sharp there. And then we have the descending line, the 5th fret to 4th to 2 to 0. That same thing. So then you'll notice the one note we're missing here is that 9th fret, the D sharp from Sanibel. Instead of the D sharp, the 9th fret, it becomes the 7th fret, C sharp. So that is the only different note compared to Sanibel's bass from Windowpane. So that's what we're going to focus on in this visual I'll put up in a second here. I'll note every time the note changes on the bass, and then on the sides and everything, I'll note all the changes in the noise layer. It goes like up and down in frequency and stuff like that. And then also some notes on the guitar and stuff I'll write in there. It's interesting how those background sound effects, the ones I marked with the expanding yellow rings, it's interesting how even though they sound like they're part of a field recording, they make sense rhythmically within the context of the song, and there sounds like there's some sort of internal logic, maybe even a pattern to it. Now, as for the story of the song and the structure of it, well, there's not much to talk about because the song is more of an atmosphere than a story like the other songs. However, it still continues the story within the context of the album. As a song itself, there's not much story, but within the context of the album, it does continue the story because of what we talked about, how it has the exact same notes as Sanibel, except for that one D sharp to C sharp change. So the story still continues. So it begins with a intro, which is just introducing us to the sort of texture we'll be listening to for the song. And then we have the body, which begins with its own little intro when we just have the bass and then the guitar with a delay on it. Then it transitions to the main part of the body, which is when we get the synth, more layers of guitar, the noise ramps up, does its own thing, all of that. And finally, we just have that outro, which again strip everything back, and we just listen to a bit of texture until the end of the song. Finally, for Windowpane, just one more interesting little detail at the end I like to point out. Right when all the sound stops, the noise stops, you can hear the tail end of the effects of the reverb or whatever effects that they had on that layer. So we'll take a listen to that. Let's get on to the finale of the album, Haruspex. But once again, we're going to be talking about the note selection and song structure first, because that will link it to how all the songs led up to this, meaning how this song works as the finale and why it works as the finale. So we're going to be starting off with a descending riff, very similar to the Sanibel descending riff, which is really important because again, we have the sound in our ear from Sanibel of the descending riff. So right away, there's a certain implication when you hear the first note, because the first note of this descending riff in Haruspex is the same note. It's the B, the 5th fret. So if you remember, the Sanibel one was 5th fret, 4th, 2nd, 0. So this time we have 5th and then 3rd fret, and we slide down into the open, the F sharp. So just note the similarity. Starts on the same note, ends on the same note as the Sanibel, and they're both descending. So there's kind of that continued storyline. Again, it's like what we talked about with Overnight, how they shifted the meaning of the note up here. We're kind of doing a similar thing here. We're moving some of the notes around. And as you'll see, this will become even more important later on in the second half of Haruspex, where we do even more note moving around, where meanings are kind of shifted and whatnot. So then we have a short little interlude between this riff where we just have 1st fret, open, and then we have the 8th fret note, but we have it lower. I'm in standard, so we can't do that. So I'll go up to the 8th fret to play it, but just know that it's actually still descending more even with this riff. So like this. I'll play it with a pitch shifter just on that last note because it sounds weird played that way. So note again the important notes here because they'll come back later. So the most important thing to note here is the 8th fret note there. Because this note is kind of like the treasured note of this song. It's like the most high value note. And it's the most powerful note because of the way that it's hoarded throughout this song, so to speak. So you can see that, normally the main riff of this section of the song just has that. And then we go into the bridge part, which is obviously not heard as often. And we end on that 8th fret note. So because it's not heard as often, and all that means it has more value, like we talked about. In between this section, we have the next section, which is based around the 1st fret for the low part, the bass part. And then we have the higher part here. I'll play both at the same time because it sounds weird without them at the same time. So note once again the higher value we're placing on that 8th fret in between the regular part of the riff. We've established our main notes for this first section, the introduction essentially to Haruspex, which kind of is all leading up, building to the latter half of the song, as we'll see. So that's the open F sharp, 1st fret, 3rd fret, 5th fret, and then of course the 8th fret that we've given higher value to. So to see how it all comes together, let's look at the structure here, right? So we start the song with that A section, which is essentially the descending riff, played 3 times, and then we play the other descending riff, the sort of bridge thing to it. So that's an A section. 3 repeats of that descending riff into 1 repeat of the other one. So we start the song off with 2 of those, 2 A's, and then we go into B. B being that whole part that then leads into the 8th fret part. So we have 2 B's, then back to 2 A's, back to 2 B's, and then 1 A, and now back to just B's, which then go into holding this 8th fret note. And this is what's vital here to keep track of, because this is how the song transitions into the second half of the song through the sort of mini climax it has at around the 4 or 5 minute mark by holding that 8th fret note. Because this whole song, it's been, as we've discussed, it's been coveted as a sort of once in a while treat that we get. And then for this climax, we go heavily into it. We pretty much only play the 8th fret note. So that, combined with texture changes, which we'll talk about in a second, is what creates the feeling of the climax to the song and creates such a powerful transition into the second half of the song. So as for the texture itself, the song starts off with a very narrow stereo space and also obviously very noisy. Even though we have the bass guitar playing the main story of the song, there is all this noise distracting from it on the sides. Then once the climax comes in, the noise sort of becomes less and less, and the layers that we hear playing that 8th fret note become louder and louder. And then at the same time, we have 2 separate instances where the stereo field widens. So that contributes once again to the whole climax aspect of this section. Now, while we have the structure fresh in our heads, let's finish that off quickly before looking into anything else. So coming off the 8th fret note there, the droning, we go into the 1st fret note, the G. We drone it for a little bit, and then we have a little stuff in the background, a short little transition through this droning part as we build energy as usual. And then we have the final riff of the song, which goes like this. So the the important thing to note with this riff, well, first it repeats until the end of the song, but as for the notes themselves, we have 4th fret, 5th fret, 4th fret, and then back down to the 1st. So what you need to take away here is that, notice, like we mentioned earlier in the song, the first half of Haruspex is centered around the 0, 1, 3, 5. And now this riff is going 4, 5, 4, 1. So once again, we've shifted what notes are okay to use, right? Except we've only shifted, the only new note, that we've introduced that is dissonant or would sound off in the first part of the song is the 4th fret. Everything else, the 5th and the 1st fret, they were part of the first half of the song too, right? Which means the meaning of them is being changed as this 4th fret is being introduced. We can hear how much more, evil, so to speak, this riff sounds, that first 4, 5, 4 part. It's a very, classic like metal riff. It's not very ambiguous or abstract like some of their other riffs might be. So that's why we get that sort of apocalyptic feeling to the end of this song. Now, finally, the song structure as a whole. So the reason the song structure as a whole is so interesting is because it's nearly identical to the song structure of Overnight. If you remember, the Overnight song structure, I'll put it on screen here, was a sort of A-B structure into a little transition into repeating a riff for the end of this, or until the end of the song, with everything else going on in the background for a bit of accompaniment. And this is the same thing in Haruspex. It's the pretty much exact same structure. There's no two other songs on the album that are as similar, because we have the AABB, AABB, AB into a little transition into this repeating riff until the end of the song. Let's go back and talk about the texture now a bit. So this is one of the most texturally dependent and texturally intricate albums on the album. When I say dependent, I mean the atmosphere, the texture, and thus the story that we talked about is super, super dependent on the texture itself. Now, we said the texture starts off with that narrow stereo field, very noisy. So right away, it's the sort of claustrophobic and very intense feel, especially coming off of the more free texture that we had at the end of Windowpane. So what's important here is that the production thing we talked about earlier, when the drum hits, for instance, in Haruspex, when the drum hits, it hits very infrequently but very loudly, which gives it an extremely powerful feel, because as it hits, all those other layers go down in volume. So the drum is extremely loud. Now that creates the feeling that the drum is like physically hitting these other layers, which is, again, a big part of what creates these super claustrophobic atmosphere in the first half of the song. Now this happens with all the layers, not just the drums. Like when a guitar part comes in, or as we said, when that 8th fret note comes in, it's often given way more value in the mix to support the story side of it, that the meaning they're trying to give to that 8th fret note. So then as we come into the climax, as we mentioned before, all the noise goes down, reduce that claustrophobic, etc. feeling, and then stereo field widens, and we go into the second half of the song. So when you're listening to the song, for this first half, I really want you to pay attention next time to how the noisy guitars on the side change and move around, morph with the song. Because even though we've mentioned the big one, like the drum, when the drum hits, they get quieter, there's actually so much more than that going on with these noisy guitars in the first half of the song. They're changing all the time. And it could have been done manually. It could have been done, with some sort of automatic way, like a side chaining or something. I don't really know. But what I do know is that it's changing all the time. I'll play a little example here. So as you can hear, even the guitars have a huge impact on these noise guitars, not just their volume, but also what they sound like. Now, the second half of the song doesn't have a ton to talk about texturally. The noise guitars do sort of change in their sound, but the most important change is that the drums in the first half of the songs, the drums are pretty consistent in volume in their hits. They're loud, but pretty consistently loud. Then in the second half of the song, well, it really starts with the transition at the climax. We get a sort of pattern. It's not a super consistent pattern of, one or two quieter hits on the drum, and then a very, very loud hit, louder than we ever had in the first section of the song. And because of how loud these hits are in the second half, you can hear the distortion that causes very clearly. I'll play an example of that here. So you can see the insane volume of the drum in the second half. It literally just distorts the entire texture of the song. And that's just the clearest example of how the layers interact in Gosling's music, because all the layers are constantly doing this to each other. Obviously, it's just usually not this easy to hear. Usually it's much more subtle. But this is the core of the production technique that the Goslings use. Make their textures feel completely as one, alive, and all unified for this main storyline that we're getting, which is primarily driven by the bass. Now, the key takeaway from all of this that the Goslings are doing is that every element is in line with the goals they have. You can argue whether or not the goal is an enjoyable one or whatever you want, whether it's the taste or anything like that. But you can't argue that they've constructed the music so that all the elements are coming together for the same exact reason at the core of it. And that's what makes the music work, essentially. Now, to close out Haruspex, let's go over a few more small details that I think are interesting. So first off, the way that the background guitars operate in the second half of the song is pretty different than usual, pretty unique. So the first thing, we have two background guitars, just to be clear. And one of them plays fairly regular, sort of psychedelic Gosling's parts, so it does something like this most of the time. Fairly simple. But the other background guitar in this second half is very unusual. It's much more dissonant than usual than we're used to. It uses a lot more notes outside of the standard notes that the bass is setting as the rules here. And also technique-wise, it's a bit different. For example, during one of the parts where it sounds very drony, because the tone and texture of it does also change. But while it's doing this drony part, it does this sort of strange thing we don't really hear anywhere else in this album, like this. Something like that, approximately. So that's just quite unusual way to play for the Goslings, and they do it very quickly, faster than that, which again, speed is not synonymous with the Goslings. So yeah, the way that background guitar interacts with the other one, the one that does that sort of thing, it's quite unusual. Now, last thing about the song, we don't end with the main evil riff. We go up to the 6th fret first, which is weird because the 6th fret note, the C, has not really been used at all in this song. It's completely out of the blue. Then from there we go to the 8th fret. That's all right. Down to 4, and then we end on the 1st fret, the G. So that's where the song ends. closing out the album, we've got Dinah. Now, not a whole lot to talk about with this one, because it's extremely standard Gosling's Fair, most generic song in the album. Doesn't really do anything new or unique for standard Gosling sound in terms of the texture, the songwriting, everything, to be honest. And story-wise, it's always seemed off to me, because we have that grand finale of Haruspex, and then all of a sudden we have this song. And it doesn't really continue the story, at least to my ear. We'll talk about that with the note selection in a second. But yeah, it's never felt like it continued the story. Now, this might be because this song's actually a rehash of a song off one of their older projects. So maybe that's why it doesn't, to me anyway, feel like it has that newer Grandeur of Hair songwriting style that they have. So let's just go into the note selection. So we have basically the entire song, or at least like 90% of it, is just droning this one note, this third fret, the A, in various ways, and then texturing it in various different ways. So something like... So yeah, they might add in the power chord note to that, or just make it an octave, or whatever. The entire song is just texturing it in different ways until we get to the last riff, which is this. So that's just the fifth fret note, the B being bent and then released, and then going back down to the third fret. So you can see story-wise, coming off of those notes that we had at the end of Haruspex, these notes don't really make sense story-wise. Just going to the third fret and then droning that the entire time doesn't make much sense, unless you want to make the argument that, you know, if you remember the first descending riff of Haruspex, the 5-3-0, you know, the same notes are there. But in my opinion, at least to my ear, when you're listening to the entire album, and then you get, after Haruspex, you get to Dinah, you don't really get the same feeling of those notes. You know, they're just completely different, completely meaning. It was already like 15 minutes in the past by this point, because Haruspex is such a long song. It just doesn't come together to me. So if you are interested in this song, and you want to learn more, I advise you just listen to the texture, because as usual, the texture is what makes the song somewhat interesting, despite it being the same note over and over. For example, I'll play a sample here. You can hear how the guitar kind of thickens at one point. Now this thickening happens in various ways throughout the album when it happens. So here, for example, throughout this song, it's mainly just adding on the power chord note like this. Now, other ways they do it, sometimes they add in the lower octave note. And they also have some pedals that have a thickening effect, especially one very important pedal that we'll talk about later on in the sort of gear section. So if next time that you listen to this song, I would listen to this sort of stuff in the texture mainly, and also the drums, because the cymbal work, especially on this song, is quite different to usual Goslings. I guess that is one thing different about the song, actually, than usual. And that is what part of what contributes to the sort of more upbeat sound of this song. The drums are much faster than usual. And they take up much more space, especially, like I said, the cymbals. So that's about it for Dinah. Let's go into the entire album song structure and story. We've gone through each song now, so let's zoom out and take a look at the entire album once again as a whole in a very broad sort of way. So one thing you'll notice I haven't talked much about so far has been the emotions and the moods throughout the album, throughout the sections in each song. That's because to me it's an extremely abstract album overall, and I believe that that's because, well, it's meant to be. So we've talked a lot about how each element in each song comes together for that one goal. And then if you read interviews with the Goslings, they talk about how it's supposed to be psychedelic music, essentially. To me, that was their goal. I don't think they had some sort of message or anything like that they wanted to put out. It was more about presenting the listener with this journey, this psychedelic journey, quote unquote, that they can then attribute their own experiences or their own feelings or whatever in the moment onto the album. And that way each listen is unique, and it can be whatever you want. You know, you can make it just a productive album while you do some work and have it in the background, or you can project some, you know, a sad experience you just had onto it, if that's what you want to do. Or each song could be a completely unique thing. The possibilities are endless, essentially, is what I'm saying. And that comes down to the abstractness. Now, I know some people do disagree with this. A lot of people who listen to the album think it has very clear intention, and it just flip-flops between its, you know, its harshness or anger, a lot of people say, and its, you know, more nice, beautiful moments. But to me, that's not the case. And, well, this is focused on my perspective of the album. So let's talk about why exactly it's abstract in, you know, the more literal music terms of it. So I think the note selection, again, is a huge part of this, because the notes are never completely aligned with each other in the, you know, like classical music theory sense. We always have some sort of dissonance or something weird going on, if that makes sense. So, for example, the riff from Croatan here. It's a classic, you know, descending riff, chromatic descending riff that you'd hear in tons of other metal songs, especially doom metal. You'd hear something like that, and you'd hear it used as like a evil sort of sound, right? But when we hear it in Croatan, because of those guitars in the background here, those guitars in the background, they don't stick to the same notes exactly. They're just a little bit off. That, combined with the noise of them, contributes to this strange, hazy, foggy feeling over the song, so that the main descending riff doesn't have the usual meaning that it would have in other songs, other similar songs. To put it more broadly, the unique Goslings note selection combines with the noise to have a huge impact on the contrast between the harshness and the beauty in the songwriting and everything. Now, importantly, it's very rarely a clear, beautiful, or harsh section, with the exception of the main body part of Sanibel and the second half of Overnight. Pretty much all the other sections are very abstract because of this conflict. You know, there might be a dissonant riff going on in one part, and then the vocals are doing a nicer sounding melody on top of that. And that's the biggest contributor to the abstractness of the album. With all that being said, you can hopefully see why I don't like to think of the story of this album and its different parts in terms of just emotion and mood and whatever. I like to use a different system, mainly think about it in terms of just intensity, or in terms of whether a section is focused more on building energy or releasing energy. Obviously, these two systems are also flawed. Sometimes a section that usually releases energy might feel like it's gathering energy on a listen for whatever reason. But any, simplified system like this is always going to have its flaws. And to me, these are the ones that work best for this album specifically. Now let's get into the entire thing. Now the album sets out to induct us with Onikar into Croatan, the sort of combo there. Now, when we were looking at them closely, we saw, pretty in detail the energy flow up and down. But when you're looking at these two songs broadly in terms of the entire album, I kind of just think of them both as energy building, primarily for Golden Stair, but also for the entire Overnight into Haruspex, extended story section that we talked about earlier, because to me that section is the core of the album, of the story. So pretty much everything up until that point is building to it in a way. Now also, since we talked about the abstractness, since these two are the first two songs in the album, they are where the listener's intention gets set if they are going to listen to the album in a abstractish way where they're putting their own experiences onto the album or whatever they want to do. They're usually going to be setting those in these first two songs. So they have a lot of importance in that manner. Now that we've been brought into the fold by those first two songs, we have to go deeper into the album with Golden Stair so that we can properly set up for the core, the album story. So by the end of Golden Stair, the intention has hopefully been set for that specific listen to the album, what sort of mood it's going to have, what direction the story will be going in this time. All that sort of details will be set by the end of Golden Stair, and then finally we can start the meat of the story. Now we've got the sewn together story from Overnight to pretty much the end of the album. And when I'm talking about setting up for this part beforehand, besides all the literal musical factors we talked about with note selection and all that sort of stuff, the really most important thing I'm talking about to prepare us for this entire story here is just the level of focus, essentially, that you want the listener to be in by the start of Overnight here. You don't want them to be thinking about any distractions they might have had on their mind or whatever. You want their mind to be focused on the music. Ideally, even unaware that they're hyper focused on the music at that point. Meaning that the music is affecting your perception of whatever you're doing at the time. Whether you're maybe taking a walk in nature or something, or you're just sitting there in your bed, whatever it is. You want to be fully immersed by this point so that the music can affect that experience to the maximum. This interpretation of the album, with the Overnight to Haruspex being the main focus of the story, you can interpret Dinah as a sort of cork stopper that we put on the bottle of the entire experience we just had. Because if the album just ended on Haruspex, you wouldn't be taken out of the experience, so to speak. You'd be kind of left to ruminate there, which could have been, good on its own terms. But with Dinah, it kind of lets your mind compartmentalize what you just heard. Especially because when you haven't heard this album a ton of times, it can kind of pass in a blur. Your mind is not exactly sure what's going on because of the noise and everything, etc. So Dinah serves to kind of send a signal to your brain that the experience is over. And then you get this, short little track to bring you back up into the real world and to integrate the experience you just had smoothly into your mind. Now, with that entire picture of the album constructed, let's think about it a little more, because obviously there's a tons of ways to interpret this. Even though I said I find the album very abstract, this specific thing is not something that has changed much for me. The story of the album as a whole, and how it's all sort of a build up, a lead into the final story, and essentially ultimately the climax, Haruspex. But there's a ton more ways you could interpret that. Of course, the second half of Overnight, where it turns quite beautiful, soothing, you could easily interpret that as the climax, the highlight of the album, or maybe the main body of Sanibel, where it kind of continues on that beautiful theme from Overnight. And then you could interpret Haruspex as a sort of apocalyptic end, maybe, to those feelings, rather than it's a climax on its own. So there's a ton of different ways the album can be interpreted. So if you have any, if you have your own interpretation, feel free to put it in the comments or whatever. I'm interested in that sort of thing. But for now, let's move on in the video. We've looked at the album story through the music itself. Now let's go through the lyrics, see what kind of insight they can give us into the story and all that. Now I'll be using the official lyrics, but note that they are not completely accurate. On Haruspex, the lyrics are incomplete as far as I can tell, and also they don't have any lyrics for Croatan, which definitely has some words, so who knows what happened there. Now right away, what you'll notice about the Gosling lyrics is that they're quite vague overall, very open to interpretation, but there are certain links, certain themes and words specifically that are used in multiple songs throughout the course of the album. They kind of all come together, as you'll see. Now, because of that, certain lines we'll skip and come back to later because they rely on information and whatnot in the other songs. Now, Onakar, specifically, the lyrics are kind of about this idea of it, whatever it is. It seems to be something important that the narrator thinks they will eventually find or see, or maybe they want the listener to find this thing. Now the first line here, see it rise. Rising is one of those themes I mentioned that'll come back later in the album. And also this idea of seeing. Once again, the word see specifically is used multiple times in the album. Now, for the idea of rising, musically, when you think about the idea of rising, there's many moments on the album that feel like some sort of weightlessness, where you're maybe floating on air, the air's pushing you up, something like that. Think of like the second half of Overnight, or that middle section of Sanibel has a similar feeling. Then the next few lines, again, right inside your writing. We'll come back to that later. Right inside your sun is rising. These themes, again, will be a thing later on, so we'll have to relate them to Haruspex, which is when they really are explored. So seek and you will find it. So obviously this line implies some sort of journey to find this thing by the listener, because the next line, take and you will steal it. Now, this line implies that you could get this it through some sort of easier method, but it would not be the same. It's right inside your pocket. You're bound to find it right inside it. Now, finally, this line I interpret to mean that this it is something theoretically easy to gain, but practically not so much, which might be love. Because as we can see from this interview excerpt with Max, that seems to be something they place a high value on. Also, it's worth going back and mentioning the line right inside your sun is rising, and now we have right inside your pocket, which of course has that imagery of a sun rising inside our pocket, which is quite powerful. So overall, the story for this song is a little bit difficult to piece together properly, but there are enough hints that we can take away some sort of message here. Last thing though, the title, Onakar, the song, Now, there are references to cars later on, as we'll see. So we'll talk about that then. Right away, we begin Overnight by redefining it as a gate now. This brings back the ideas of the journey in Own a Car to find the it. Well, now there's this gate as well, which could be interpreted as meaning some sort of barrier preventing certain people, maybe who haven't done the journey or who don't have the correct traits or whatever, from accessing or seeing the it. And the following lines, we say it's a gate, color of a red line, and then it's a scared line. What they're doing here, they're kind of changing the subject, because it's a scared line. Well, we're saying the idea of it is a scared line, but also it kind of means that the red line we just mentioned is a scared red line. Now, this is something that the Goslings do quite often, this sort of mixing of what the subject is, as you'll see later on in this song. Then they say a broken headlight, the next line. This introduces the concept of cars, for instance, which can make the last two lines, the red line and a scared line. Well, a car from the back swerving on a road would look like a red line, scared, swerving, potentially. And then I'm on a deadline. So lines are clearly some sort of concept throughout this song. And deadline obviously just has the two connotations of a deadline and death. Saddest mother in the bread line, we've got that line idea coming back. And then some strange black arriving. Can you see some strange black arriving? Once again, the idea of seeing something. Now, as for strange black, we can only infer, maybe, if we're right about the swerving car at night, well, then there would be a lot of darkness in that scene. Though also, maybe it's related to the bread line. The last line here, sticking around, somehow surviving. We're once again kind of playing around with the subject here. The mother in the bread line, somehow surviving, plus the strange black that's arriving. Now we're going to end the song with this paragraph about rising. As we mentioned in Own a Car, rising is a recurring theme throughout the album. So if you remember the first line of Own a Car, see it rise. Well, now we're starting off this section with I rise, which obviously implies it is I. Even though before in this song, we started with it's a gate, it's a scared line. So a lot of different things going on in terms of that definition there. And rising out the window, that's interesting to note because obviously there's the song Windowpane later on in the album, but also because cars have windows. And then out the window, that's interesting because falling out of a car could relate back to broken headlight, some sort of car crash potentially, and the deadline, which implied something to do with death. Also, the relation between death and some strange black often associated with death. And also this all comes back to the idea of survival as well in the second paragraph of this song. The last line, glass eye, could be the imagery of the broken headlight or any headlight really, as well as it's just wordplay on the eye usage we've been doing throughout the song and all the songs. So you can see how there are these themes of death in this song and rising mainly, plus all the changes to it that we've made. A big alternate interpretation we can have of this song that also extends to the other songs as well as the album as a whole, if you want to take that far, is that this song's about ego death, which is an experience where someone essentially feels like they lose their sense of self. It's often attributed to psychedelics as a sort of like easier way to achieve it, so to speak. So there's a lot of hints in this song as well as the others, the album as a whole, that, you know, could potentially be leading us to that conclusion. For example, in this song, in Overnight, we have that idea of death running through the entire song. Then we have I'm rising at the end, in the last paragraph. Rising sort of hinting at potentially enlightenment, you know, those sort of topics, themes, because in a lot of those, you know, religions, cultures, they have ego death as a sort of linked thing to enlightenment, potentially along the way. And even in, you know, the psychedelic culture itself, we have that ego death sort of portrayed as a goal, which could potentially be leading us back to that Onakar idea of it. And that thing we're seeking in Onakar. And as you'll see, these ideas continue on in Haruspex especially. There's also the line about glass eye at the end of the song. If we interpret that eye as the self sort of eye, then that would mean fragile self. So, you know, ego ready to be broken, in other words. Now, lastly, there's some song names that hint toward this. So Overnight itself, for instance, it could potentially be hinting at how psychedelics can have this ego death experience happen overnight, when, you know, traditionally it's considered something that should be done more carefully, so to speak. And they're seen as a shortcut to it. Also, the song name of Windowpane could be a hint as well. So just keep all this in mind, this interpretation in mind, as we move on with the album and as we look at the entire thing at the end of this. Now, Sanibel drifts a bit from the themes and words we've been using so far lyrically in the story. It seems to be more about describing this island of Sanibel, which is a island in Florida, which is where the Goslings are from. It's known for its seashells that wash out from the Gulf of Mexico and also its wildlife. Now, because it doesn't really use the same themes and words that we've been using so far, it's quite a bit harder to glean any information or make any interpretations here that have substance. Especially in the second half, as you'll see, they drift even further. So we start off with the longing to see it once again, just like the first line of Onakar, see it rise, going back to the idea of seeing something here with a longing. Then we just have some description, presumably of the experience on the island. The giving wave taking, for instance, could be seen as the motion when a wave washes out onto the shore and then recedes back out into the sea. And we go into describing the color a little bit. Easels of masters, implying the nature itself. It has some sort of masterful palette, masterful take on art visually and color, that sort of thing. Then we have the big shift in the lyrics with Shine Silver Dollar. So still sticking to color, but we're going from describing this sort of beautiful nature scene to suddenly a dollar. Very strange. Then my eyes have deceived me. This kind of reflects that strange turn in theme we've had potentially. Some sort of deception could be. Also, the line, a masthead for dagger, could be referring to the same thing. And we have the strange ending of my sweet friend, which could be interpreted as a sort of sarcastic remark on this friend, since we just had the ideas of betrayal. Now we're calling this friend sweet, which they would not be in that context. However, there's also different ways to interpret this line, as we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, another thing to mention, if you remember the end of Overnight, we ended with glass eye. This could also be a reference to Sanibel, because there's a somewhat famous lighthouse on Sanibel. So overall, the story of Sanibel is a bit confusing. We are clearly describing the island in the first part of it, and then something shifts. But the words and stuff, the themes in the second half there after the shift, don't really correlate to anything else anywhere in the album, so it's pretty hard to make any meaning there. Besides, My Eyes Have Deceived Me, we do have a few references to eyes, like the glass eye again at the end of Overnight, but that's about it. The alternate view we could take on this song, if we interpret the sea of my tasting, if we interpret that sea there as the sea, the viewing something theme that we've had throughout the album. So we interpret the line as the, instance of seeing something to my tasting, the narrator's tasting. Then we can interpret this entire song, the description here of the waves, the salty fragrance, as this it once again, or something to that effect. This also would color the second half of the song, the strange half, in a completely different light. Now the line of "My eyes have deceived me" could be referring to this thing we're seeing as somehow had some sort of deception or something going on there. And then "my sweet friend" could also be referring to something we're seeing, the it, or something to that effect. Haruspex. First, let's get into the title. Haruspex was somebody in ancient Rome trained in Haruspice, which was the practice of inspecting entrails of sacrificed animals to divine the future and read omens and that sort of thing. So you'll see once we get into the lyrics that we can view the lyrics for the song completely different through this lens. And even the entire album, when we're talking about certain words like the see theme that we've had, to see something, well, seeing the future, I mean, there's a lot of extra implications we could look into here. Now, also, last thing to note is that, well, there's actually a lot of themes, historical themes, throughout the names of the tracks and some of the lyrics. For example, Croatan was, I believe, a Native American group living in what's now North Carolina. So you can see Max or Leslie perhaps had some sort of interest in these historical topics. So we're going to be going into the themes much more clearly here compared to Sanibel, though if we do interpret Sanibel in that alternate way, then it is about the themes as well. Anyway, so in my life I have seen, just like Sanibel and Onakar, we're beginning with a line about seeing something. However, here we've changed the tense. So in Onakar, we have see it rise, what I thought I would finally see. So that's a different connotation there. Sanibel, longing to see it, as if it's something we're waiting to happen. And now Haruspex, in my life I have seen. So we're now talking about this event or whatever it is as if it's already happened. And we then say the event, in this case, in this context, is the sky writing down the tale of God's love. So just like Onakar, we have that line about writing. And God's love, well, Max did say in an interview his parents were very religious, although I believe Leslie wrote the lyrics for the song. But anyway, that could be a potential source for where this God idea came from. Or it could just be a more general, use of any of the multiple ideas of God and what God could be. Like a sort of self thing. In the hair of the sun, just like Onakar's The Sun That Was Rising, and also just like the cover of the album and the name of the album, Grandeur of Hair, on the cover having two figures connected by hair, it seems like. Now in the stars, we're just continuing some of the description, it seems. And now we were young, all new. Now this line's interesting because it once again evokes that sense of time that we've had, that we see the evolution of this of the event throughout the entire album's lyrics. and the seeing something. Now we say we were young, all knew. There it is, some right arm. Well, first off, right arm is another Gosling song on a different project. So could be a connection there potentially. But also Own a Car is all about using the word right inside your writing, right inside your sun is rising. And importantly, it's right inside your pocket, talking about the it or whatever it may be. And also the next line, taking on what is. Just like how in Own a Car, we have take and you will steal it. More repetition. What is doubt? Now this is interesting because doubt has not been used at all up to this point. Not really in concept or the word itself. I think we can use this as a sort of hint for potentially what we could be talking about here, as we'll see as we go on. Come back to this. Now here we have a bit of a shift in the way we're talking and in life when I'm gone. So we're not talking about it in a past sort of way now. We're talking about this as if it's something in the future that's going to happen, just like some of the wording we had in Sanibel and a bit in Own a Car. Now, the narrator saying they'll be far too rich to bear this gift. So I like to interpret this line like gift is the it, or the thing we're seeing, or something along those lines. But then that begs the question, what are they far too rich with, if not the gift itself? Because they seem to be separate here. The other thing that's a bit of a conflict here, well, up to this point, this it and all that has sounded like something you should want to acquire. However, here he's saying, please bring me back, which can imply he doesn't want this gift. So there's a bit of a disconnect introduced here. Or a different interpretation, he could be saying that he's far too rich, as in the narrator just already has so much that they don't need this extra gift. Maybe they'd rather someone else have it or whatever. A lot of possibilities there. So you can see this entire first portion of the lyrics, which we should note, all these lyrics happen in the first half of Haruspex during the AB section, and then going into the climax, which leads into the second half. So we kind of tie a lot of these themes together right here at the end and provide a lot of clues as to what exactly could be talked about throughout all the lyrics. So these clues about being far too rich, about the gift, about doubt all of a sudden, these are the main extra clues we've been given here. Also, the massive clue right at the start of the sky writing down the tale of God's love in the hair of the sun. So as we said, sun is an important thing throughout the entire album, but also, I mean, it's basically saying that something here, whether it's the it, whether it's what the lyrics on all the songs have been describing. I mean, there's, again, a lot of possibilities here, what they could be saying the tale of God's love is. Personally, I like to think the entire album is this tale of God's love. Another thing I find quite important here, going back to Own a Car, right inside your writing, whereas here in Haruspex we have the sky writing, then right inside your sun is rising, again our sun for some reason is rising, whereas in Haruspex it's just in the hair of the sun. This could kind of go back to some of the stuff about shifting subjects that's been going on throughout the album. It almost feels like the narrator is confused. I find the connection between Haruspex and Own a Car the most important out of all the songs, because of course Onakar is the first song of the album, and it sort of lays the foundation lyrically of a lot of these topics and words and themes and everything that we're going to be using. And then Haruspex closes it all out in this first section, and it's also the climax to the album, as we talked about earlier. Now, as for the second half of the lyrics here, which play during the second half of the song after the transition to the repeating riff, well, they're quite vague, and they kind of don't use the same words that we are used to at this point, which makes them harder to get a accurate interpretation, but we'll do what we can. So the first two lines, solid are the mighty, forward are the meek. I mean, they're kind of related to each other, because we're saying the mighty are solid, meaning stationary, upright, tall, assuming, and strong, something like that, like a statue. And then forward are the meek. So the meek are ones trying to do some sort of journey, almost, you could extrapolate. So going back to Onakar, when we're talking about the it, and we say seek and you will find it. Now, I find this interesting because here we're saying forward are the meek, which again, presumably trying to do some sort of journey, we're saying are meek. But in Onakar, we're saying to find the it, we have to seek. So an interesting little dichotomy there. Once again, feet are walking on the sleek, just continuing that idea of some sort of journey. Never saw the change of guard. So I interpret this line to mean that the meek haven't seen that something has changed, the guard, so to speak, the guard protecting you from, what you shouldn't do. The meek have not noticed, so they're continuing with this idea of forward rather than switching it up or whatever needs to be done. Finally, in Season's shallow cheek, note that that's cheek, not creek, like you'd expect. I guess that's just a play on words to bring back the imagery of people, figures, maybe the hair of the sun sort of thing, or the figures on the album cover. Because, when you look at the words itself, it would make more sense to be creek. So I guess it's just a play on words. You can see this last paragraph doesn't really help us to piece together the story of this song or the album overall too much, mainly because of that forward of the meek line kind of throwing a wrench into our interpretations. Though, of course, that is under our interpretations. Under other interpretations, maybe this last paragraph would make more sense, which we'll talk about. Now, let's look at the whole thing overall for a second here. I like to interpret the characters of the whole album to be these sort of big elements of the story: the sun, the sea, I, it, the sky, God, God's love. These sort of big nouns that are repeated, most of them are kind of part of nature, notice. But these nouns sort of come together, the way that they interact with each other throughout the entire album. That's essentially what forms the story of the album. Now, one other thing I forgot to mention earlier, the sky writing down the tale of God's love in the hair of the sun could be interpreted as when there is, the rays of the sun coming through clouds, coming through the sky. That could be the hair. So now in this context, it would be the sky that the hair is going through. So the sky's writing on it, so to speak. And that could be called the tale of God's love. And with this interpretation, well, in religion, the sun is often seen as a sign of God's power and all that. As I was editing together the clips for this video, the Goslings released the music on Bandcamp. At the same time, they attached the lyrics for Croatan and Golden Stair to the songs, which I forgot to mention earlier. Golden Stair also was not on the original lyrics that came with the CD. So as far as I know, now all we're missing is a few phrases at the end of Haruspex. Now let's go over Croatan and Golden Stair. Luckily, the lyrics here don't really change anything that I said earlier. Croatan seems to be about the story of the album cover primarily. It also gives us insight into the narrator, because for this specific song at least, and maybe for the album as a whole, we don't really know, a woman, presumably the woman on the album cover, is the narrator. And earlier I would say he a lot of the times when I was referring to the narrator, and that's just because I thought of, I mean, when I think of the Goslings, I think of Max, obviously, as the leader, so to speak. But, of course, that's not really accurate or correct. I didn't have any evidence or purpose, in saying he there. And as we can take away from this song, it's more likely that the narrator in all the songs is a woman. The first paragraph here is concerned with describing the relationship between the man and woman in the cover art. They seem to be sort of imposing, well, voluntarily imposing on each other's personal space and property, with the "you can catch in my teeth" line and "I can live in your house." Both of these lines saying a similar idea, similar thing of taking up each other's space, personal belongings, etc. And the next paragraph sort of repeats that. Always keep in mind we are cats of one kind. Again, this could go back to that idea of taking each other's space because they are of one kind, sort of idea there. Now, the last line there, though, of the second paragraph, always keep it in mind. It's sort of deceptive because on first glance, it's easy to dismiss it, but it has the "it" there once again. Always keep it in mind. Now, if we want to look at the song as a whole, this song is less about the "it" than most other songs on the album. It only really touches on it here and later on, as we'll talk about. So with that being said, always keep it in mind sort of states that even though this song is not talking about it, we should still keep it in mind. And also, we could extend this to the other songs that aren't as much about it, like Sanibel, for instance. Also, keep in mind the first two paragraphs here of the song kind of have a underlying connotation that the relationship is a positive one, or in some way positive, even though the album cover art, they seem to be more in some sort of disagreement. We'll touch on this again later as the second portion of the lyrics sort of match the album cover art more. Next, though, we have the "my muscles all turn to brine" into the next paragraph about flower head wounds. I'm focusing on that because I don't think there's a ton we can take away from this specific line plus paragraph. It's all just guesswork, really. So flowers' head wounds are small. I'm going to imagine head wounds as hair, potentially. When you look at the way that hair, like follicles, go into your scalp, it could almost be portrayed as a dagger or something. Now, this also goes back to potentially masthead for dagger, I believe was the line in Sanibel. Those themes of betrayal there, perhaps they're carrying over into this song. Also, if we look at the album cover art once again with this head wounds idea in mind, we can see it as a bit of a bloody scene potentially, with the droplets on the side of the figures and all that. And even when you look at the figure on the left, there's a circle on their head that almost could look like a hole of some sort. Now, the final three paragraphs of the song go into the "it" idea once again. Come on, leave it off, sleep it off, take it from me. Once again, the idea of take from earlier instead of running. So this gives us insight into what the potential disagreement these two figures, the man and woman, could be having here. The man seems to be running instead of taking it. This all leads back to the ideas of it as a sort of journey, as something we need to acquire from earlier on in the song. However, now in this song, Croatan, it's being portrayed as the woman having it and the man trying to take it. Or her wanting him to take it, rather. No more mother, no more friends. Cut it close, shear it right. So mother, going back to overnight, the saddest mother in the bread line, potentially. But also this whole cutting off of mother and friends could potentially be hinting at that sort of abusive relationship thing where one of the people in the relationship makes the other cut off their friends and family, so they rely completely on the partner. But also, of course, we're talking about hair. And the shear it right. If we look at the CD itself, the original CD, there is some shears on the inside of the CD there. So potentially this could just be talking about hair as well, but we are using hair as a metaphor throughout the entire album, so keep that in mind as well. Then the last paragraph, come on, cut it, wear it long. A bit of a conflict here, a bit of a paradox. We're saying to cut it, but also wear it long, which to me means that it is not hair, of course. But also a different way we can interpret it is that the it we're saying to cut and the it we're saying to wear long are two different its. That's another way we could interpret it. I mean, when you think about the different meanings, different definitions we've given to it throughout the entire album's lyrics, I mean, you can just, there's a ton of different interpretations for this entire song that you could do. However, we should focus on the ones that center around the album cover and hair, essentially. Which to me means we can look at the album cover, look at how they're connected by hair, and then we can interpret the line, for instance, wear it long. We could see that as meaning some sort of like have pride in showing this relationship, this connection of hair, this long connection. Although that interpretation is interesting because the connection of hair between them being long could be interpreted as a negative, but also a positive thing. So we're not quite sure there. The other interesting thing when we think about the cut it, if we think about them being connected by hair, it seems a bit strange if you think about it in that way, that the narrator would want this connection of hair being cut. However, I still think that thinking about the lyrics for this song specifically in terms of the album cover is the best way. Especially when you think about it in terms of that connection of hair, while also keeping in the back of your mind the different ideas of it that we've had throughout the album. Now, Golden Stair, another song starting with a idea of it, a different definition. Here's the gist of it. Gonna get my fix. Now, there's been a lot of sort of connotations to addiction and that sort of idea of a fix, like in Croatan, as we just talked about, the potential strangely reliant relationship between the man and woman on the cover. So this just reinforces that entire theme. And it's going to take a long time. Again, saying it, whatever it is, going to take a long time. And also interesting is how we have the literal word of time here in the song. Because time as a concept theme is obviously super common in music and, well, everything really. But in this album, we haven't explicitly referenced time so far, or in any of the other songs really. However, we have played with the tenses of different things, as we talked about how a lot of the ideas related to it were, in anticipation of this it, and then the it happened in the past and all that stuff. However, here we're explicitly bringing in the idea of time. It's going to take a long time, although, again, this is actually saying it as if it's something that's going to happen in the future, just like the way that they said it in Sanibel, for instance, when they said longing to see it. On the boulevard is the crux of it. At first, this seems like it could be a potentially huge line in terms of our understanding of what it is. Except when you think about it, think about what or where is the boulevard. Well, we don't really have any concrete ideas anywhere else on the album, except for the title of Own a Car, perhaps references cars, and also, as we mentioned earlier, Overnight could also potentially be talking about cars or driving, but there's not really any solid clues as to a boulevard specifically, so we're a bit lost as to the crux of it here. And once again, ending it off with, it's going to take a long time. Again, just more it taking a long time, although we actually removed the it in the last two lines. We have sun, it takes a long time, and then just gonna take a long time. So the meaning could be shifting there again. Also, the last line, gonna take a long time to arrive. Remember, in Overnight, we have, can you see some strange black arriving? So potentially a connection there. And when you think about the song name itself, and we have these ideas of something taking a long time, and the name Golden Stair, so as if we're climbing up some sort of thing, potentially the journey maybe that we were talking about earlier is taking a long time, but we're doing it to get the fix or something, the it maybe. A lot of potential there. And also the idea of the stair being golden gives it a implication like it's extremely important, which is also the implication we've given to the idea of it throughout the entire album. So keep that in mind too. Finally, Golden Stair could be a reference to the Chilkoot Pass, which is essentially a trail used during the Klondike Gold Rush in the late 19th century, used by prospectors, often with the aid of natives, to pass through the mountains there. There was a specific section of the ice that was cut into 1,500 steps, and that was started to become known as the Golden Stairs. Additionally, it could also be a reference to one of the best known paintings of the artist Edward Burne-Jones. You'll notice I didn't mention Dinah's lyrics at all yet. Well, that's because they don't really tell us anything more. Plus, like I mentioned earlier, that song was from an earlier project and thrown on here, so I don't really think there is any connection lyrically with what's being said in the rest of Grandeur of Hair. We've kind of neglected looking at the music side of the vocals up to this point, but now that we've looked at the lyrics, let's look at that music side so you can tie them together. Now, Max said in an interview that the music wasn't really anything until Leslie added the vocals. I tend to agree with that, and it's kind of reflected in something else he said in an interview, that he liked to save a lot of the mics, the tracks, for her vocals, because he worked on an 8-track system, so he was quite limited with what he could do, unless he wanted to go to that extra mile so that he could go above the limit. But anyway, the vocals are double-tracked on pretty much every song. So there's 2 layers doing usually the same thing, same words, just maybe different inflections, or, you know, the tail ends and beginnings of words might be shifted around a bit, but the core is the same. Except the panning will often be different. You know, like the most common setup would just be one on each side, but there's also a lot of moments where one is like on the side stationary and then another one is shifting around, doing whatever, which is quite similar to what the background guitars on parts like, you know, the second half of Overnight, what they would do there. The internal logic sort of to how they pan the background guitars and the vocals is quite similar, as is the note selection, except that the vocals note selection is a little bit less dissonant, more of a focus on just sounding pleasant, sounding nice to the ear and all that stuff. Now, let's take a look at an example that'll display all this. So pay attention to the effects. First, there's a mainly reverb is used on the vocals, and that's quite similar once again to the background guitars. And also pay attention to the panning, like we said, the movement, and the double tracking, the layering of the vocals, all that. For the final section of this video, let's go over some of the things outside the music itself that we can get information from. So the interviews, we'll look at the gear they used, all that sort of stuff. Last little tidbit, if you are trying to recreate the Gosling sound, or at least a similar sort of sound, the guitars are not that noisy in the 5K plus hertz range like you might expect, especially because of that tape noise and all that. They're actually really heavy in the like 2 to 2.5 hertz range. So that's where you should look at if you are looking for a similar noise sort of sound in your guitars or whatever layer you might be doing. Now for the interviews here, I'll just put some of the interesting ones on screen and then talk about a few of them. Now, these two questions go a little bit hand in hand. It is quite interesting to hear Mac's thought of the music as metal. Then to hear that the Melvins was one of the biggest influences for him, I find a little bit odd because I don't really hear that the Melvins influence that much. Maybe some of the dronier Melvin songs, but that's about it for me anyway. Now, this answer is quite interesting because there's a lot we can try to infer here. That first sentence, I don't think of our stuff that way in terms of goals. Quite an open-ended statement. Not quite sure if he means they don't think of goals really at all in a more general way, or if he means in the way that the interviewer is sort of asking the question here. They don't think of goals in that way. We're not sure. Now, the second part of his answer here about not really aiming for that harsh part of that dichotomy of beautiful and ugly that we talked about plenty. It's interesting because it kind of reframes the entire album when you look at his answer here. I mean, we, as listeners, most people listen to this album think of that dichotomy as very, very important to why the album works and why it's good and all that stuff. So looking at his answer here kind of gives us a completely different perspective on his side of it. It's also interesting that he says Leslie's vocals shape the vibe of each song, because we talked about how, to me, the bass is what tells the story of the song, but the vibe of the song, the atmosphere, the mood, that sort of stuff, that could be something completely different that he does see as shaped through the vocals. Now, obviously, we don't know how specific he is being with his wording here. Maybe he meant the story as well. Who knows? This line at the top here about own a car being pretty purely done, I find intriguing because, even knowing this, when I go back and listen to the song now with that in mind, I can't really hear anything in that manner to separate it from the other songs in the album, the ones that would be more overdubbed and whatnot. This line here at the bottom about Max saying he thinks the songs could be better if he did more interesting bass lines. Well, it's interesting to take this into consideration as a hypothetical, because we know how important the sort of repetition of the bass lines, how they usually just repeat the main riff for each section of the song. We know how important that is to the sort of hypnotic tone of the album, and it sort of sets in stone the manner that the stories are being told throughout the album. So, as a hypothetical, if by saying this he means they would still be repeating just with a bit of variation, well, that wouldn't really change it much. But on the other hand, if he means that they could do something completely different from the guitars, for instance, that would completely change the texture and the story at the same time. So that could have a huge effect. Because as we talked about, the guitars and bass and everything in the story are quite unified. Especially the guitars and bass are usually playing very, very similar things. So separating that could create a huge change in texture. And it might be an interesting avenue to explore for anyone trying to make similar music. So we have a lot of talk about gear here. The most important pedal, though, that he mentions here is that Boss Pitch Shifter Delay. It seems he used it for a lot of different effects. So I don't have this pedal, but when I was doing my own covers of the album, I used a bass octaver on my Pod HD 500. This effect can replicate a ton of the things you hear on the album. So for instance, the climax of Croatan, when you have that bass come in super loudly, take the energy from the other layers, you can do that by tying a bass octaver to a foot pedal and, doing it in time with the song. Another instance is the sort of anxious part of Golden Stair, where we have the hum, the buzz of the guitar noise being, intermittently hit by the drum hits. You tie the bass octaver plus a volume pedal to lower the volume a little bit, all to your foot pedal, and then time it with the drum hits, and you can recreate that effect. Now, if you want to go a step further, if you play in a band, or even if you can play drums with your feet as you play guitar, you can do the same thing, tie effects like a bass octaver and a volume pedal to your foot pedal, and then use that when your drummer hits, and you can recreate that production technique live, in person. So you can see there's a ton of creativity possible here, a ton of options you have in recreating their sounds, their production techniques outside of your DAW. Another big one, for example, if you want to recreate that effect when, a drum hits or something hits and it distorts the entire texture, like in Haruspex when that drum hits extremely loudly, you could do the same thing, tie the bass octaver and the volume pedal to the foot pedal, and then add also a distortion or fuzz or saturation, whatever sounds best to you. Tie that also to the foot pedal, time it with the drum hits, and there you go. Your entire guitar texture will sound like it's being distorted or affected, whatever, by that drum hit. Now, lastly, it's interesting to note that they did not have a lot of gear. They did it on just a few pedals. To close out this project, let's look at some email exchanges I had with some of the people involved in Grandeur of Hair. This, for me, was my favorite part of the project, and it really gave me insight into what the actual process of the album was, opposed to the ideas I got in my head about how it might have been made as I listened to the album. So first off, we've got Adel 156, as he's known by online. So he's got a long history of his own, art projects, especially music and that sort of thing. But for Grandeur of Hair specifically, he did drums on every song after Overnight. Well, and Overnight. So Overnight, Sanibel, Windowpane, Haruspex, and Dinah. Let's take a look at what he said. So there's a few key takeaways here that I'll come back later once we talk about what Max told me in my emails with him. So first off, it seems that in all the areas of the recording the album, drums, guitar, everything really, they were super happy, super embracing of accidents and mistakes and those sort of things, viewing them as happy accidents, as Adele says here in his email. So this, when we listen to the album with this in mind, it kind of explains a lot of the little details in the playing, and they most likely were mistakes, a lot of those details. But of course, if you choose a recording with a mistake, that makes it an intentional decision, which so at that point it's kind of not a mistake in a way. Anyway, and then Adele going into the freedom here. So this also explains a little bit about the drumming, because when you listen back to the album, you can definitely hear that there are times when there was just a little strange detail here and there, or a little variation in the pattern. And so according to Adele, he would do this sort of thing, and then Max would want him to go back. Also, Adele saying that Max wanted him specifically because he wasn't a true drummer, quote unquote. Max told me a pretty similar thing. Basically, it was about wanting repetitive sort of drumming, nothing complex, so that there was space in between the hits or, the other parts of the songs to sort of come to the forefront. Now, the one interesting thing about this is that it still had some contrast. For example, on Onikar and Golden Stair, we had those two parts where the drumming is quite frantic and is, right at the front of the song of what's going on. And an interesting point about that is that both of those tracks had a different drummer, Brendan Grubb, on drums. So the only two tracks with the super frantic, more in-your-face drumming had the same drummer, which is interesting. Might be coincidence, might not, because Adele does say that Max sort of had the ideas of how he wanted the drumming to be. So maybe Max told Brendan to do those more frantic parts on those two songs. We don't really know. I think Haruspex is a perfect example of this having space in between the hits. So the other sort of big lesson here, so to speak, that Adele and Max both talk about is this idea that they weren't super skilled musicians, and yet they were still able to create this, great end result, great product. Now, this gets into a bit of a philosophy at this point, because you get into talks of what skill really means at that point, because even if Max couldn't play much more than power chords and that sort of stuff, that doesn't mean he wasn't skilled at making his own style of music, because he made a very similar style of music for years straight. I think it was almost 6 or so years they worked on Goslings. So that's a lot of time still spent on making a pretty similar style of music, which means he became skilled at making that style of music. Even if he wasn't, skilled at guitar or at whatever in a more broad, sort of general, classical musician sort of way, or, what we typically think of as high skill, he was still skilled at composing his style of music, at using, mainly power chords and that sort of stuff to compose this style of music. So that's a bit of a detail there we have to consider when we're thinking about this. Now, as for my exchanges with Max himself, for various reasons, I won't be showing the screenshots of the actual emails on screen, and also I'll avoid talking about super specific details he mentioned about the album. Instead, we'll focus on sort of the big picture here, so we could relate it back to what we've talked about so far with how the album was made from, a listening perspective, from the perspective I presented earlier. So we'll get into the sort of ideas and philosophy side of how the album was made, from his side of it. Now, this is because this is where we can sort of learn the most as musicians or artists or whatever ourselves, and put this into our own projects. First off, let's start off with the mistake side of things again, the sort of skill aspect of it. So according to Max, there was a lot of improvisation based on loose song structures, essentially. So each individual take would have its, deal of improvisation based on that loose song structure. And this, of course, leads to those happy accidents like Adel talked about in the emails I had with him. So this kind of comes down to not doing too many takes, not practicing your song too many times before you go for that recording, especially with, easier to play songs like this. Because of course, if you play a song, hundreds of times over before we're going for the recording, you can eventually get to a point of playing it where you're playing it robotically. You're not making like any mistakes. Of course, that can fit other styles of music, but that's of course not what we're going for here. So unless you, intentionally make mistakes or play less robotically or whatever, that can seep into the playing. So I think that was a big thing Max wanted to avoid. And this comes back to the style of the songs and his skill set, because his skill set fits the style of the songs, which as a musician, generally that is what you should aim for. You should sort of build up your skill set to fit the sort of music you want to make. And that's what Max did. He's not the most skilled guitarist, of course, but the music itself is also not super hard to play. It doesn't go past like power chords most of the time, right? And that's perfect for this improvisation side of it, because improvisation can take a lot of time to develop, especially for more difficult songs. But with an easier to play song like this, it's not that difficult to, throw in a little note here or there. Or also another side of it, which he didn't talk about, but I'm just going to infer was probably part of it, is fixing mistakes that you make in the moment. Like maybe if you miss a timing on one note, then for the next note, you purposefully adjust the timing of that next note so that it sounds like that first note's mistiming was on purpose. These sort of stuff, it's all much easier to do, of course, on these easier to play songs that are quite repetitive. So that fits his skill set as a musician. Especially because another thing we have to consider here is that the Goslings, like I said, was about a 6-year or so project. Max is also doing the mixing. He's also somewhat, contributing to the drumming parts and all that. So he doesn't have time to do all this. He doesn't have time to be, an expert, highest level of everything, which means this style fits that. Now, the other big topic I want to talk about that Max mentioned was where musicians sort of get their inspiration. So to paraphrase what he said, he basically thinks of it like musicians have a certain source of inspiration. And, when this source is being tapped into, it's super easy to make music. But oftentimes, a lot of bands will run out of this source for whatever reason. It will no longer really be there, but they'll keep trying to make music, which is when you're sort of spinning your wheels. Personally, I can relate to this. This definitely happened to me. So for the Goslings specifically, it sounds like they had this source of inspiration for, the running time of the Goslings. And then after Death Garage, it basically just wasn't there anymore. And that's why they stopped recording. So it wasn't a hard decision at all, according to Max, to stop making the music because the inspiration was just gone. So it's a bit hard to take something away from this, at least for me personally. So I kind of like to take it a step further, because in our conversation, Max talked about this source of inspiration like it was sort of a thing you can't really control much, sort of external. Again, paraphrasing, I'm not 100% sure if this is what he meant, it's just an email. But anyway, to me, I think it's much more valuable if we consider this source of inspiration as something that we can actually influence and we can create more of. I think the problem is that oftentimes we have a source of inspiration that inspires, maybe our first project, maybe our second project too, but that source won't last forever. However, finding a new source or making a new source is a very difficult thing, and we don't really realize that we even need to do that, I think, a lot of the time. So that's sort of what I took away from this, what he's talking about with inspiration here. I think you can't hang on to that same source of inspiration for too long. At a certain point, it's going to dry up. And that's when your, music is going to go down in quality. It's not going to be as fun to make music, etc., etc. So that's it for this video. Except that's not the end, because once again, we have another late stage edit, because I got into contact with Neddal, who contributed some guitar parts to Sanibel and Haruspex, and he gave me a ton of information. He was extremely helpful, went above and beyond the questions I asked him, which was already a big ask. So thank you to him. Now let's get into what he said about the album and his parts. So what he links here right at the start are some old archive interviews and reviews and similar sort of things. So I'll link some of these in the description. If you have a chance, there's a lot of media, especially reviews related to the Goslings that was lost in time, but some of it we can find on archive.org. It's super interesting to note here that Max didn't give instructions to Neddal in terms of what he wanted or anything. And it's tempting to read further into this, try to, get a hint as to how or what Max thought of the different parts of the music, how he interpreted their function. But really, there's a million different reasons that Max could have given instructions to some people and not to other people, and we don't know the full story. So the only way to really get insight into what this means would be to get it from Max himself. There's too much guesswork otherwise, I'd say. However, all that being said, my interpretation is that it shows he thought of the drums, obviously the percussion, as sort of the backbone of the music in a sense. And so it'd be less malleable than the texture work. But that's another thing, since Neddal didn't specify if he did the texture work in these songs or if he did some of the, the riffs that sort of drive the sections. We don't really know what parts he did. So if he was doing more texture work like the solos, then obviously that would not be as important to follow any strict guideline as opposed to if he was doing the main riff of the song. Now, there's a little hint here at the end of this answer that Neddal doesn't know if Max looped his parts or put the whole thing in there. I find that interesting because I can't really remember hearing any loops in Sanibel or Haruspex. However, in songs as layered, chaotic as this, it would be quite difficult to hear a loop. So maybe that's worth listening for in a future listen of those two songs. I also asked Neddal about the whole skill thing. Again, it's hard to get a complete answer because we're just talking by email, but he did sort of go further into this thing where he says he maintains a level of technique to get the sounds he wants out of the instrument. So that's sort of what I imagine, at least, that Max also did, because as we talked about, he wouldn't have time to do every single thing to the highest level and whatever. So essentially the most efficient thing to do is to just maintain the technique, the skill required to do or to output what you want to make. And we can finally end this video off on that note. I'd like to thank everyone involved with the album and everyone who talked with me, all that, etc. Put any questions you have in the comments. I'll try to get to them. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.